I have spent my whole life driving people crazy. If you should not say it, I can't wait to scream it out the window. I'm impossible. I never understood why I was so wild. I never knew how come I had to be a firebrand. I thought there was something wrong with me. Then I realized there is something right with me. Now I know I was born this way. I didn't invent myself after all.
Because Americans don't say Wurtzel the right way. It's Wurtzel.
Wurtzel.
Yeah.
That's okay.
This video is going to be about Elizabeth Wurzel, an American writer who quote-unquote made a career out of her emotions. And her most well-known literary work, Prozac Nation, that came out in 1994, and which deals with the topic of depression and mental health in general. Since I have done a video on Girl Interrupted and Susanna Kaysen, I thought it would only be fair to discuss Prozac Nation, because these two books and movies usually go hand in hand. It's believed that Elizabeth Wurzel was a pioneer of confessional writing, the kind of writing that isn't afraid to tell the truth, no matter how self-absorbed, whiny, narcissistic, humiliating, or stupid it may seem and sound. The kind of writing that allows you to accept how messy and complicated humans and their emotions are. Elizabeth Wurzel writes with such hilarious self-awareness and rawness, and she raises so many interesting points regarding having a mental illness, some of which are still very polarizing. And that's what I will be doing in this video, discussing the said points. But first, I'll start with some background information. I feel like a defective model, like I came off the assembly line flat out fucked, and my parents should have taken me back for repairs before the warranty ran out. Elizabeth Wurzel was born and raised on Upper West Side of New York City in a Jewish family. She was the only child. Quote, Donald Wurtzel met my mother on an escalator at Macy's in Herald Square. She was in the executive training program and he was a buyer in the boys department. My mother married my father because he was the first one who asked. He was handsome. She was 23. End quote. When Elizabeth's parents got married in 1965, her father got a job at IBM, and the family moved to the city of Poughkeepsie, where, as Elizabeth writes in Prozac Nation, her mother went nuts with boredom and bought herself a pet monkey that she in the end gave away to neighbors because they also had one. Apparently, it was not that uncommon back then in the 60s. Quote, he never went to college, and my mother, fresh out of Cornell, took a personnel test that qualified her for a better position at IBM than he had. But, as she recalls, company policy did not allow a wife to outrank her husband. So my mother found this or that part-time thing. End quote. Eventually, after a while of trying to find a job, Elizabeth's mother returned to New York. The idea was that Elizabeth's father would get transferred and join her at some point. In 1966, Elizabeth's mother got a job at a publishing company called Random House, and as Wurzel writes in her article for The Cut, without Random House, she would never have been born. Her mother ended up having an affair with Bob Edelman, an American photographer known for his images of the civil rights movement, who at the time was also working at Random House. They bonded over their unhappy marriages. Quote, and so my mother got pregnant, which is what happens when you are 25 and not using birth control. She only told Bob. Bob knew, and she asked him not to tell. My mother was ashamed that she had an affair, so she hid it and made her husband think he was my father. She ran up to Poughkeepsie and spent the weekend with her husband as soon as she realized she was pregnant. What did he know? What do men ever know? Do they count days, months, years? That is what women do. End quote. In 1967, Elizabeth was born, and 2 years later, her parents divorced. Bob was a family's friend. He lived a block away, and Elizabeth used to play with his adopted daughter until they were 6. Bob's marriage also collapsed after his wife found out that he'd gotten another woman pregnant. In 2015, Bob was present at Elizabeth's wedding, where he gifted her $5,000. A year later, in 2016, after Bob passed away, Elizabeth finally found out the truth about her biological father. It was not her mother who delivered the news. It was Bob's girlfriend. And in the end, Elizabeth chose to forgive her mother. She had to. The thing is, Elizabeth's relationship with the man she'd spent almost 50 years believing to be her father was one of the biggest conflicts of her life. Quote, I have been working out that relationship all of my life, in writing and therapy and conversation, with cocaine and heroin, with recovery and perseverance, and with my thoughts. I have been working out the wrong problem. Thousands of words on the wrong problem. I have aced the wrong problem. End quote. The first article Elizabeth published in 17 when she was 16 was about her father Donald. Half of Prozac Nation is dedicated to her being puzzled over the fact that she could never connect to him. After the divorce, Elizabeth saw Donald once a week, but he would sleep through majority of those visits because he was addicted to pills. When Elizabeth was 5, Donald remarried. In the book, Elizabeth remembers how excited she was for the wedding, even hoping to be a flower girl, but nobody invited her. At 11, Elizabeth began experiencing first symptoms of depression. In Prozac Nation, she likes referring to this state as being morose. She started self-harming in girls' locker room during lunch at school. She talked about death and how meaningless and plastic everything seemed. At 12, while being at a summer camp, Elizabeth took her first overdose. She started going to a psychiatrist twice a week, but the situation between her parents got even worse. They hated each other. Elizabeth would hear her mother yell at her dad over the phone. The arguments were about Elizabeth's therapy and money. According to the divorce agreement, it was Donald's responsibility to pay all the doctor bills, but he didn't want to anymore, despite his insurance covering most of it. So the parents went to court, and Elizabeth got even more depressed. When she was 14, Donald disconnected his phone and moved away. In the book, Elizabeth writes that Donald would show up in her life from time to time, but their back-and-forth conflict would continue to stay unresolved. Quote, "Ever since my father had left, he and I had these twice-a-year reconciliations. We'd get together with the best of intentions. I'd keep swearing to myself that I'd forgive him for abandoning me, while he'd promise himself that he wouldn't let his guilt overwhelm him. We'd have a few pleasant conversations, and then I wouldn't hear from him for another 6 months. And then we'd go through all the emotional trauma of, 'You're a terrible father,' and 'Your mother made it impossible for me to stay,' all over again." End quote. When Elizabeth got into Harvard, the period when her depression reached its peak, Donald and his wife came to visit. Seeing her father so nonchalant and happy enraged Elizabeth. You see this scene in the movie as well.
He disappears for 4 years, and then he thinks he can come back here and take pictures of his perfect Ivy League daughter?
When Elizabeth asked him if he could pay for her therapy like he'd promised her once again, he refused, citing that she also failed to keep her end of the bargain.
You made a promise.
You haven't written me. You never called me.
It's funny and sad to see how petty this argument is, how it's clearly not about money whatsoever. You have a child who just wants to have at least some tangible proof that her parent cares about her, and you have a parent whose ego prevents him from doing the right thing, that is, prioritizing the child. Maybe Donald suspected Elizabeth was not his. This relationship unfortunately didn't have a happy ending. Quote, "My father and I never really reconnected. We tried, and eventually we stopped doing even that. When he died in 2014, I had not seen him since 2001. End quote. When you're a child of divorce, oftentimes you have to pick a side, one parent who you can handle, and Elizabeth obviously picked her mother, a parent who seemed to care about her more. In the book, Elizabeth uses the following adjectives to describe her mother: hysterical, exhausted, and overwrought. As a kid, Elizabeth sometimes found herself in a parental role when dealing with her mother. Quote, "I always felt a sense of responsibility toward her, and it made me feel extremely restricted in the range of negative emotions I was able to express. I could skip school, I could get lousy grades, I could hide in the girls' locker room for hours, but I could never completely drop out. I could never lose my mind to the point where they'd have to send me away to a loony bin or some place for juvenile defectives, because my mother would not be able to survive such a personal debacle." End quote. The book recalls a particularly insane episode when Elizabeth's mother threatened to end her life after finding her daughter's birth control pills in the drawer. She wanted Elizabeth to promise to never do something like this ever again. Quote, "She's raving. She wants me to go to Dr. Isaac for one appointment to talk about why I behave this way. And it seems crazy to me, just plain wrong, that my boyfriend left me, my father left me, and I'm sitting here trying to talk my mother away from the ledge." End quote. Elizabeth Wurzel writes about her parents with complex range of emotions and perspectives. There are passages where she experiences her hatred towards them for messing her up, for not loving her enough. But there are also moments when she feels sympathy for them and their life circumstances, like how Donald's side of family has a long history of mental illness, and that might explain his reliance on pills to get by. Or how her mother grew up in a completely different period when women's rights were restricted, and how she never understood that it had contributed to her own oppression. Quote, "She is the nuclear physicist. My mother is like everyone else. She thinks she's normal. She's sure her behavior makes sense. She believes she does the right thing. Since she cannot imagine that this is not the case, she's surprised to find out that yes, she makes bombs. And yet I love her more than anyone else in the world." End quote. When you know even these tidbits of information about Elizabeth Wurzel's childhood, you might think that it's a no-brainer she became depressed. But the first point I have highlighted from Prozac Nation is that you don't need to have a horrible backstory to justify your mental illness. And at the same time, when you think that your life story is not that bad and very common, you might discover that despite it being very common, it's not any less serious or painful. The scariest part is that if you ask anyone in the throes of depression how he got there to pin down the turning point, he will never know. There's a classic moment in The Sun Also Rises when someone asks Mike Campbell how he went bankrupt, and all he can say in response is, gradually and then suddenly. When someone asks how I lost my mind, that is all I can say too. This first point is something Elizabeth tries to come to terms with in her memoir. There are many potential causes of this or that mental disorder, and every person's situation is different. There's simply not enough evidence at the moment to support this or that claim, but we know that it can be rooted in your biology, like abnormalities in your brain and genes, or it might be caused by environmental factors, such as family upbringing and social stressors, or it can be a mix of both. These are the main theories. In some cases, it's very hard to pinpoint what exactly went wrong and when, and Elizabeth struggles to explain her condition to her mother, who wants to hear an impossibly simple answer. Quote, I try to think of some explanation for my depression that will make sense to her, but I can't imagine what will. I can't even explain it to myself. I can't even look her in the eye and say, well, I had a tough childhood, because it sounds like a line, an excuse, a boulder I've conveniently placed on my shoulder so that I can live with all my misery. It's not like I was beaten regularly. It's not like I was raised by wolves. It's not like I'm an exceptional case. I'm just one of a whole generation of children of divorce whose parents didn't handle their personal affairs very well and who grew up damaged. End quote.
What is wrong with you?
Nothing.
Elizabeth is aware that the divorce of her parents and their behavior have affected her greatly, but she doesn't think it's enough of an explanation for her mental problems because her internal feelings do not match with her external circumstances, which in turn makes her feel like she isn't even allowed to be depressed. There's one particular conversation Elizabeth has with her therapist where she uncovers those feelings. Quote, this is going to sound dumb, I began, far too aware that everything I said was so trite. But the thing is, I really don't feel like I have a right to be so miserable. I know we can look back and say my father neglected me, my mother smothered me, I was perpetually in an environment that was incoherent to me. But what? What other excuses do you need? I wasn't feeling gross enough to mention Bergen-Belsen, cancer, cystic fibrosis, all the other real reasons to be sorrowful. But a lot of people have hard childhoods, I continued, much harder than mine, and they grow up and get on with it. It made me sick listening to myself. How many times, and to how many therapists had I made this speech? When would I stop wondering what right, what nerve I had to be depressed? And now with this going on about all my blessings. End quote. The movie adaptation of Prozac Nation only focuses on Elizabeth's mental state when she was in Harvard, her writing endeavors, and her relationship with her parents, friends, and boyfriends. The memoir, however, takes Elizabeth to various places as she's trying to run away from herself. She works for a newspaper in Dallas and travels to London for a change of environment, only to regret it almost as soon as her plane lands. Elizabeth also experiences a miscarriage, unaware that she was even pregnant in the first place. And in a weird, some might even think, messed up way, Elizabeth is glad that now she has a real tangible explanation for her emotional turmoil. She enjoys the attention she's getting so much that she keeps milking it. Quote, suddenly my problems seemed to have a physical cause, and I was more satisfied with somatic explanations than the usual psychic ones. When I told close friends that I'd just had a miscarriage, that I hadn't even known I was pregnant, they all seemed to have much more sympathy for me than when it was all just depression and also ineffable. As a result, I kept playing up the miscarriage issue even long after my cramps, my terrible cramps, had subsided and I had all but forgotten about it. I had become so good at saying glibly, don't give me a hard time, I've just had a miscarriage, that I almost forgot that it was the truth. I felt like hell. I was physically drained and emotionally empty, and according to my accounting, I didn't think I'd be able to get away with using the I was pregnant and didn't know it until excuse for very much longer. End quote. Since Elizabeth can't equate the amount of pain and misery and despair she's enduring with the events of her life, she starts wishing for even worse things upon herself. She starts to self-destruct. But self-destruction for Elizabeth is also a way to make her life more bearable. Mental health problems and substance abuse more often than not go hand in hand. So Elizabeth drinks and takes drugs to get through her days. Sometimes she even wishes she had a drug problem instead of depression.
Is she on drugs?
Oh, I wish I was on drugs.
Lizzie.
Quote, I found myself wishing for a real ailment. Found myself longing to be a junkie or a cokehead or something real. If it were only a matter of keeping me away from my bad habits, how much easier it all would be. I know now, of course, that alcohol and drugs also mask a type of depression that is not so very different from my own, but getting help for substance abuse can be reduced to the deceptively simple focus of keeping away from the dope. But what does getting help with depression mean? Learning to keep away from your own mind? Wouldn't it be a whole lot easier to get rid of Jack Daniels than Elizabeth Wurzel? End quote. As Elizabeth learns more about depression, she discovers that it's a form of addiction in itself. In a sadly ironic twist, after publishing Prozac Nation, Elizabeth Wurzel would get addicted to drugs, this time for real. She would write about her addiction in her second memoir, More Now Again, which I love more than Prozac Nation, but I will talk about the spirit of her life later. And now, it's time to move to the second point I've underlined from the book. Mental illnesses lie along the spectrum, and the same disorder shows up differently in different people. Depression is a lot like that. Slowly, over the years, the data will accumulate in your heart and mind. A computer program for total negativity will build into your system, making life feel more and more unbearable. But you won't even notice it coming on, thinking that it is somehow normal, something about getting older, about turning 8 or turning 12 or turning 15. And then one day, you realize that your entire life is just awful. One morning, you wake up afraid you're going to live. After Prozac Nation came out, a good number of critics and readers were annoyed by how whiny, self-indulgent, and selfish Wurtzel sounded. Some depressives completely denounced Elizabeth's portrayal of the disorder. Some negative reactions were also due to the fact that many expected the book to be a sociological study about a whole generation, instead of a personal story of a girl nobody knew. The original title was I Hate Myself and I Want to Die. Prozac Nation was just an epilogue, but Elizabeth's editor insisted for it to be the title of the whole book, so it was just a marketing tactic.
The one thing they didn't want it to be was a memoir because they didn't think a memoir would sell. They thought, who would buy a memoir by somebody who's 26 and no one's heard of? That's how ridiculous this was. It was just like unheard of for somebody to write a memoir. And then I was like, and I want to be on the cover. But I actually was that bold. I was like, I'm being on the cover. Okay, we're not putting something else on the cover. It's going to be me.
Even now, if you go on Goodreads and read the reviews, you will see the same descriptors, plus the fact that Elizabeth was privileged, which is true to some extent, but kind of irrelevant if we're talking about the disorder itself. Like, is she in lesser pain because of it? And you will also find some people diagnosing Elizabeth with other disorders, because everybody is an armchair psychiatrist now. Some say Elizabeth sounds like she has a personality disorder like borderline, or she might even be a narcissist. Like, depression is an exclusive club and you have to be invited. Sorry, the place is already full, maybe try a different disorder. The main idea some can't seem to wrap their heads around is this. How can Elizabeth party, have boyfriends and friends, write articles for newspapers, and just study in Harvard of all places if she's in such misery?
I wish I'd have thought of something like this.
Thanks.
And this is a tale as old as time. Things might look amazing from the outside, but behind closed doors, it's a completely different story. That's how you get high-functioning drug addicts and alcoholics, but things always come to an end. You either completely destroy yourself and die or get better. There's so many people walking around who are not even aware that they have a mental problem. You just learn how to survive and adapt to the best of your abilities, because life doesn't care that it's hard for you to do certain things. And it's not like everything that Elizabeth has is permanent and perfect. She skips classes, she messes up her friendships and romantic relationships, and there are times when she struggles to write. However, in Elizabeth's case, writing is her life. It's what she does, and it's the only thing she can hold on to in order not to sink even deeper. Mental health is a sensitive subject, but I think since depression is one of the most common disorders, and it's a disorder that gets romanticized and portrayed in art the most, people are very defensive of it. Even though there are many types of depression with their own symptoms and causes, and depression itself can occur with other illnesses. So it makes sense that not every mentally ill person will relate to the author's experience, and it doesn't mean that hers is wrong or untruthful. Pain is pain. There's no point in comparing suffering. In Prozac Nation, Elizabeth is diagnosed with a typical depression, and in the final chapter she reveals that there is a possibility of her maybe having a manic depression, which is now, as Google tells me, is known as bipolar disorder, or cyclothymia, which is a milder form of bipolar again. Basically, she has some type of mood disorder. In Elizabeth's case, she can't handle romantic rejection. She becomes quite obsessed with her lovers and then fears that they will abandon her, which is why some people think she might have a borderline personality disorder. I haven't haven't found any information to support that claim. And Elizabeth experiences manic episodes. When she's very energized, she writes like crazy, and she can't sleep because of all the thoughts racing in her head.
Jesus, Lizzie, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. Do you mind?
The movie shows this behavior, but the biggest episode like this in the book happens when she's in Dallas for a summer job, writing 2 to 3 reports a week, plus overworking to the point that the company doesn't have the money to even pay her for all the work she's doing. Elizabeth even thinks that her depression is gone, but of course, after a while, she starts cracking up. The type of depression Elizabeth has makes her seem functioning. Quote, a typical depression is not just a mild malaise, which is known diagnostically as dysthymia, but one that is quite severe and yet still somehow allows an appearance of normalcy, because it becomes over time a part of life. The trouble is that as the years pass, if untreated, a typical depression gets worse and worse, and its sufferers are likely to end their lives out of sheer frustration with living a life that is simultaneously productive and clouded by constant despair. End quote. When Elizabeth got her diagnosis, she thought it perfectly explained her behavior at the time. The diagnosis was not easy for doctors to come by due to occasional appearances of manic-like episodes. Quote, but in the end, the diagnosticians conclude that I've been too persistently down and not floored enough in my manic periods to be bipolar. In the book, Understanding Depression, atypical depressives are characterized as people who respond positively to good things that happen to them, are able to enjoy simple pleasures like food and sex, and tend to oversleep and overeat. Their depression, which is chronic rather than periodic, and which usually dates from adolescence, largely shows itself in lack of energy and interest, lack of initiative, and a great sensitivity to periodic, particularly romantic rejection. I feel suddenly so much less lonely. For so many years I wondered what was wrong with me, why I felt so awful but still somehow didn't completely fall apart. For years I thought there would be no help for me until I got progressively worse. End quote. Point number 3. Mental illness can make you self-absorbed, selfish, and hard to deal with. Sometimes I get so consumed by depression that it's hard to believe that the whole world doesn't stop and suffer with me. In my last video, while I was talking about the movie Spencer, I said that a mental illness can turn you into a me type of person, and some people got upset by that comment. I shouldn't have said any mental illness, but some mental illnesses can make you more self-centered, and obviously everybody is different, and it depends on the severity of your disorder, how it presents itself, and how well you can control it. Some can reflect and retrospect on their behavior and improve it, and others can't control it, and they're not aware that they might be doing something wrong. That's why there is an insanity defense that can be used in a criminal system. However, even in this case, a mental illness can explain a person's behavior, but it still doesn't excuse it. There is still a negative stigma around mental health, but it's weird not to talk about all the shitty things it brings, not only to you, but people around you, people who take care of you. Now, before I go into examples, I also understand that sometimes it's hard to know if a person's negative traits are the result of their illness or if they're just being an asshole. But in a way, it doesn't matter unless you're using your mental illness as an excuse for your bad behavior. You still have to work on managing it. When I'm talking about point number 3, I'm referring to people who have the capacity to be self-aware and work on their behavior, and Elizabeth is one of them. Not everybody will relate to this point, and I envy you if you don't. Quote, me and my feelings. I could empty rooms with my feelings. I could fill rooms with my feelings. I don't know how there was space for anything else in the world besides my feelings. End quote. As I've already said, Elizabeth's behavior is what makes it hard for some people to enjoy the book or the movie for that matter. She cries and screams a lot, like the exact picture people without mental illnesses have in their minds about those who are ill. Nowadays, it seems offensive to use the word hysterical while describing a woman specifically, since it was used in a sexist manner, perpetuating a stereotype that women are inherently emotionally unstable. But as a horrible cry myself, sometimes it's the perfect word to describe the state you're in. Elizabeth uses this word in the book many times. Quote, I felt like such a messy, highly reactive creature that I didn't want people to get near me. I felt radioactive, and it made me deeply suspicious of anyone who'd be fool enough to get in touch and distance of this poison girl. Every little thing was grounds for hysteria. End quote. Sometimes, when people around Elizabeth are trying to help, she gets overwhelmed, and as a result, she lashes out at them.
You gotta get some sleep.
Will you just fuck off?
I think this is the most common situation people can relate to. Many people, even without mental disorders, get angry and say mean things they don't really mean, and then regret it later. You can understand and even explain why Elizabeth is behaving this way in the moment, but you also have to see the side of people who just care about her and are trying to help. It hurts to get a reaction like this in return, but when people finally say enough, I can't take it anymore, can you blame them for leaving you?
I can't do it anymore. This has got to end. Next week is just going to be some other crisis.
When you're trapped in your head, when it's hard to control your thoughts, when you overthink every little thing, it's easy to become very self-absorbed. It's kind of the nature of many mental disorders. And when you are in this state, you get defensive. You don't see the other perspective, and you perceive some things and people as a threat. Life itself is a very isolating experience, in my opinion. Yes, you can share it with others, but at the end of the day, you can never perceive anything the same way. For example, when siblings develop different coping mechanisms or different psychological issues despite having been brought up in the same household. I really like the author's note in the Prozac Nation. Quote, "The Talmud said quite sagely, we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. As far as I'm concerned, every word of this book is the complete and total truth. But of course, it's my truth." End quote. Elizabeth acknowledges that her depression is not only sucking the life out of her, but out of the people around her as well. It's very hard for me to believe that there is a mental illness that doesn't in any way impact your relationship with people you actually want in your life. Sometimes you unknowingly end up pushing people away. Quote, "I know how taxing it is to do something even as small and brief as having a meal with a depressive. We're such irritating people, can see the dark side of everything, and our perpetual malcontentedness kind of ruins it for everybody. It's like watching a movie that you think is great, spiritually uplifting, a lot of fun in spite of its faults, and you're with someone who is in film school, who is a professional movie critic, who tends to analyze every moment of the picture until the pure joy that you feel just because you do, no need to explain it, is expunged by all his nitpicking and hair-splitting. That's what it's like to be with someone who's depressed. Only, it's not just one movie or just one night. It's all the time." End quote. When it comes to romantic relationships, some might say that Elizabeth is almost the embodiment of the crazy ex-girlfriend. She actually said it herself in her 2014 article for the New York Times. Quote, "I was the worst girlfriend ever. And yes, I'm the crazy ex-girlfriend you hear about. I had no regard for time of day or time of year or time at all. Perhaps I just had no regard. I was often hysterically upset or ragingly angry about nothing at all. And entire relationships became about failed communication and no more. I did this to everybody. I held rooms full of people hostage to my foul moods. I made men I loved scared of me." End quote. Elizabeth calls her lovers a dozen times a day, or she's impatiently waiting for them to call her, the feeling that consumes her to the point she can't do anything else.
So you'll drive him crazy, piss him off.
I don't know what you're talking about. And f*** you for saying that.
She asks them over and over if they're still in love with her, if they still care, if they're going to leave her. In her memoir, Elizabeth shares details about several of her boyfriends and relationships, but the movie adaptation only focuses on 2, and I think even these 2 guys are supposed to encompass several. The majority of the time in the movie and in the book is devoted to Elizabeth's relationship with Rafe. He becomes an important person that illustrates how deep Elizabeth feels and how far she can go in her desperation to be loved. When Rafe tells Elizabeth that he will spend his full winter vacation helping his mom to take care of his 11-year-old sister, who also seems to be mentally unwell, Elizabeth can't take it.
I need you to be with me.
And I wish I could be.
When Ray finally leaves, Elizabeth keeps calling him every day, interrupting whatever he's doing.
Oh, he's busy? Well, could you tell him it's urgent?
Elizabeth doesn't stop at that. She announces to her therapist and her mother that she should go to Dallas for a friend's wedding. She will write articles for the newspaper and make the trip profitable. It will be good for her. Quote, "What neither of them knew was that I was planning a layover in Minneapolis on my way back from Dallas so I could see Rafe and make sure he still loved me." End quote. Eventually, Rafe breaks up with Elizabeth on the second try because she managed to convince him not to the first time he tried. Relationships and sex for Elizabeth is a way to shut her brain off and turn her heart on. Quote, "Rafe was merely a makeshift solution I'd come up with, a pill I took to make the bad feelings go away. But now that he was not cooperating so well, now that he was refusing to be used this way, now that he was insisting that he wanted to be my boyfriend and not my panacea, he was no longer part of the solution. He was part of the problem." End quote. While looking back on her relationship with Rafe, Elizabeth acknowledges that his behavior might have enabled her not to get better, that Rafe liked being in the role of a caretaker, and it made Elizabeth even worse.
You like other people's misery.
You're sick.
Once again, not everybody will relate to this. Every mental illness is different, but in some cases, bringing your attention to your bad behavior works. It helps you get out of your head and finally see that you're hurting people around you. If you are surrounded by enablers who I'm sure just believe that they're helping you by being nice and understanding, it's harder to get better. Quote, a psychologist once explained to me that the worst thing a therapist can do to an extremely depressed patient is be nice, because that kindness creates a stasis, allows the depressive to remain comfortable in her current miserable state. In order for therapy to be effective, a patient must be prodded and provoked, forced into confrontations, given sufficient incentive to push herself out of the caged fog of depression. End quote. Elizabeth writes that her next relationship was completely opposite. Quote, in striking contrast, Nathan, my boyfriend after Rafe and after I was a whole lot better, did not suffer my depressive episodes gladly. In fact, he hated them. They were the thing about me that he liked the least. He would say, come on, this is ridiculous. He would say, enough already. He would say, snap out of it. And you know what? His approach worked. Forced to behave, I behaved. Forced to cope, I coped. By the time, of course, I had the tools with which to manage my emotions more efficiently, but still, I think Nathan's way was better than Rafe's. In the years I was with Nathan, I thrived, while with Rafe, I just deteriorated. I have no doubt that Rafe's eagerness to be there for me while I was hurting encouraged me to hurt more. Of course it did. I wanted so badly to please him. End quote. Perhaps the worst example of Elizabeth's selfishness in some people's eyes comes when her mother gets mugged, which leaves the letter with heavy bruises and a broken arm. Elizabeth visits her mother in the hospital, but she can't bring herself to care about the situation due to her depression. It makes her feel unworthy of her own misery yet again. Quote, I try to act concerned, which I guess I am, but really, I'm too miserable to care. I feel duty-bound, but I'm so absorbed in my own depression and misery that I almost hate her for burdening me with this now. I hate myself for being so low, and I hate my mother for needing me to be otherwise. And I'm on the whole disgusted that I'm even thinking about these things at a time like this. End quote. Depending on where you are in your recovery, you might actually find Prozac Nation sadly hilarious. Elizabeth is extremely intelligent and funny, and as she said in one interview, life is silly.
But what bothers me is that I sometimes think, like when I've gotten, I've looked at bad reviews where I've thought that there was one thing where somebody said like something was inadvertently funny, and I thought, oh my God, and you're inadvertently stupid. I mean, how could you not realize? I mean, I know what's going on. And I mean, it's just so much of life is so silly, especially when you get into like one emotional mess after another.
That quality was lost in the movie adaptation. The movie was described by some critics and viewers as a hysterical mess with everybody just bawling and yelling at each other, which is still true to some people's experiences. But as Elizabeth said, it didn't differentiate this movie from any other movie about depression.
The sad thing about the movie is it was basically made by a lot of kind of humorless Scandinavians. And I mean, no, the book is funny and I'm funny. And you just do not get that in the movie. But it is a good movie. If you want to like spend, 2 hours honestly really crying, it really is, it's relentless, which in a way is an achievement. I mean, but that's 2 hours of your life that you can't get back.
Elizabeth Wurzel was not afraid to put her meanest and most selfish thoughts and actions on paper, and many people still admire her for that. She said, quote, I wanted so very badly to write a book that felt as bad as it feels to feel this bad, to feel depressed. I wanted to be completely true to the experience of depression. I wanted to portray myself in the midst of this mental crisis, precisely as I was, difficult, demanding, impossible, unsatisfiable, self-centered, self-involved, and above all, self-indulgent. As I found myself saying to not a few people who would tell me they found the book angering and annoying to read, good, very good. That means you'd feel a frustration and fury reading the book that might even be akin to the sense of futility experienced by most people who try to deal in real life with an actual depressive. Depression is a very narcissistic thing. In many instances, it looks an awful lot like me. End quote. Elizabeth had many friends in her life, many people in business who, despite her being difficult sometimes, still couldn't get enough of her. In her 2015 article for The Guardian, she wrote, quote, no one ever gets over me. No one ever gives up on me. People disappear, sometimes even for years, but they always come back. I've learned that when someone says, I hate your guts, it's just the beginning of the negotiation. They'll be back. I'm impossible to let go. End quote. This might sound very narcissistic to some, but according to many, Elizabeth was irresistible. and annoying at the same time. One person who knew Elizabeth wrote, quote, "After my marriage fell apart, Liz showed up at my first post-separation dinner party, wearing an outrageous miniskirt with spikes and chains and spouting equally outrageous stories of sex with rock stars, completely hijacking the conversation until we were all laughing so hard I forgot about my broken life. Yes, she was famously difficult. Yes, she could be infuriating, hypercritical, annoying. But when the term narcissist got thrown around to describe her, I'd put my foot down. No, I'd say. She's not a narcissist. It's not that." End quote. Another friend of hers revealed, quote, "She could be tough, but she was incredibly sensitive. I take everything personally," she once told me. "If I ever stop taking things personally, then I won't care anywhere near as much." She cared deeply for her friends and the animals in her life, and was not above texting you out of the blue to let you know that you are irreplaceable. End quote. Point number 4. A person can romanticize their own mental illness. I was quite surprised when I saw that some reviews accused Elizabeth of romanticizing depression in her book. The criticism, of course, once again, was related to the clash between the lifestyle Elizabeth had and her achievements, and people's opinions on how a perfect depressive should behave and look like. According to one critic, Erica Warner, who in 1994 wrote a review of Prozac Nation for the Harvard Crimson, quote, "This girl may be depressed, but she knows how to party. All this makes depression look pretty good. Sure, the author was a miserable wreck, but she really lived." End quote. Erica goes on to say, and I think nobody told Erica that she kind of came off a bit petty and jealous in her own article, quote, "I've been depressed too, and with many of the same symptoms as Wurtzel's, though I certainly haven't capitalized on it as effectively as she has. However, that doesn't mean I want to listen to her self-indulgent whining or that it will help me come to terms with my own life." End quote. In Prozac Nation, Elizabeth actually draws a distinction between madness and depression. She believes what people usually romanticize is not depression. There's nothing interesting about it. People love madness. That's what fascinates.
Madness is too glamorous a term to convey what happens to most people who are losing their minds. That word is too exciting, too literary, too interesting in its connotations to convey the boredom, the slowness, the dreariness, the dampness of depression.
She then gives examples of celebrities that fall into madness category. For instance, it's Kurt Cobain in every one of those Nirvana videos, looking like a man who is sick, deeply sick, who needs help badly and wears his desperation like a badge of cool. It's every great moment in rock and roll, and it's probably every great moment in popular culture. However, even though madness might seem more interesting to the outsiders, underneath all the crazy hides the same suffering.
The word madness allows its users to celebrate the pain of its sufferers, to forget that underneath all the acting out and quests for fabulousness and fine poetry, there is a person in huge amounts of dull, ugly agony.
Why must every literary examination of so many writers and artists keep perpetuating the notion that their individual pieces of genius were the result of madness? While it may be true that a great deal of art finds its inspirational wellspring in sorrow, let's not kid ourselves about how much time each of those people wasted and lost by being mired in misery. This is not to say that we should deny sadness its rightful place among the muses of poetry and of all art forms. But let's stop calling it madness. Let's stop pretending that the feeling itself is interesting. Let's call it depression and admit that it's very bleak." End quote. I believe romanticization is something we just do as human beings. It comes naturally. Nostalgia is built into us. We romanticize past relationships while forgetting all the bad stuff that actually led to their end. We romanticize our future by having certain expectations of how our life will look like. Our human imagination is both a powerful tool and a curse. If we take sad aesthetics and romanticization of mental illness, meaning presenting it in a more appealing way than it actually is, looking at it as something cool and exclusive, you will have two camps. To some, creating and consuming sad art is a way of coping with their issues. Elizabeth describes how relatable sad music was to her when she was a young teen, and this passage I'm about to read kind of describes the process of romanticization. Quote, "Sometimes I lie in my own bed and listen to music for hours, always Bruce Springsteen, which is weird, I have to admit, because I'm becoming this really urban, punked out kid, and he's kind of the spokesman of the rumpled working class suburbs, but I identify with him so completely that I start to wish I could be a boy in New Jersey. I try to convince my mother that we should move out there, that she should work in a factory or as a waitress in a roadside diner or as a secretary at a storefront insurance office. I want so badly to have my life circumstances match the oppressiveness I feel internally, it all starts to seem ridiculous. After all, Springsteen's songs are about getting the hell out of the New Jersey grind. And here I am, trying to convince my mom that we ought to get into it. I'm figuring if I can just become poor white trash, if I can just get in touch with the blue-collar blues, then there will be a reason why I feel this way. My misery will begin to make sense." End quote. This whole section is reminiscent of the first point I have made about not feeling like your pain is justified because your circumstances might look like a perfect life to some. It makes sense that she will then start looking for validation, something to relate to, and usually it's art, books, music, and movies. Moreover, Elizabeth compares herself to Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. She imagines ending it all just like them. She imagines her own funeral and how people will remember her as a promising young woman full of potential. Isn't it romanticization at its finest? But it comes naturally. I truly believe artists can't really be held responsible for how people interpret and perceive their work. You can't really know if a post on Tumblr is made by a person who is really suffering from a mental disorder and is trying to process their emotions and reach people with the same issues, or if it's someone who is sad fishing for attention and sympathy. Even the second case might not be just some teenage antics, but a behavior that in itself screams for some mental illness diagnosis. People who pretend to have a mental illness are usually teenagers who are struggling to develop their own sense of identity, so they try on everything. As Elizabeth tries to pinpoint when her depression started, she writes about an alternative persona she tried to put on herself when she was around 11 in order to get the attention she lacked at home. It was supposed to be just some kind of punk rock statement, she writes. However, soon it started to get more serious. Quote, "The trouble was, I thought this alternative persona that I had adopted was just that, a put-on, a way of getting attention, a way of being different. And maybe when I first started walking around talking about plastic and death, maybe then it was an experiment. But after a while, the alternative me really just was me." End quote. This is when the darker side of romanticization appears, when relatable sad aesthetics fully consume your life, when all you know and feel is sadness and dread, which soon turns into full numbness and apathy. When you get sucked this deep into the life is depressing rabbit hole, it can be hard to get out. There is weird comfort in your own misery that many might be scared to admit. Being constantly down, depressed and anxious becomes the norm, and feeling other emotions just seems weird and uncomfortable. You convince yourself that this version is who you truly are, and that's when the romanticization of your own suffering comes in. The vicious cycle of looking at yourself as the constant victim to fit into those horrible feelings, to justify them. It's addictive. There's this very funny quote I like from the book that really makes you think how our surroundings influence our mental state, how you yourself can create a perpetual state of misery in your mind. Quote, "I don't know if depressives are drawn to places with that certain funereal ambience, or if in all their contagion they make them that way. I know only that for my entire junior year of college, I slept under a 6-foot square poster emblazoned with the words, 'Love will tear us apart.' And then I wondered why nothing good ever happened in that bed." End quote. Elizabeth writes that she fell in love with her own depression because she thought it was all she had to offer, that without it, she had no personality. Quote, "In a strange way, I had fallen in love with my depression. But depression gave me more than just a brooding introspection. It gave me humor. It gave me a certain, what if up I am shtick to play with when the worst was over. I had developed a persona that could be extremely melodramatic and entertaining. It had at times all the selling points of madness, all the aspects of performance art. I thought this ability was what my friends liked about me. In fact, over time, in the years of my recovery from depression, most of them let me know that it wasn't what they liked about me at all. It was what they put up with, because when I wasn't busy flying around the room and ranting about nothing, I was actually just good to talk to, even a good friend. But before I knew this, I was so scared to give up depression, fearing that somehow the worst part of me was actually all of me. The idea of throwing away my depression, of having to create a whole personality, a whole way of living and being that didn't contain misery as its leitmotif, was daunting. How would I ever survive as my normal self? And after all these years, who was that person anyway?" End quote. Point number 5. Everyone's recovery journey is different. No matter how many chemicals I have ever used to bleach or sandblast my brain, I know by now only too well that you can never get away from yourself because you never go away. Since people diagnosed with the same mental illness can have different experiences living with it, it makes sense that the recovery will also look different. Elizabeth went through 9 psychologists before she found a good therapist in her eyes, someone who took her seriously, someone who was willing through trial and error to find a solution that works for her. Elizabeth believes her severe depression could have been prevented if she had a good therapist from the start, but as she entered university, her situation got so bad that she needed medication to survive. Quote, "In the case of my own depression, I have gone from a thorough certainty that its origins are in bad biology to a more flexible belief that after an accumulation of life events made my head such an ugly thing to be stuck in, my brain's chemicals started to agree. There's no way to know any of this for sure right now. There isn't some blood test that you can take to find a mental imbalance. Had I been treated by a competent therapist at the onset of my depression, perhaps its mere kindling would not have turned into a nightmarish psychic bonfire, and I might not have arrived at the point, a decade later, where I needed medication just to be able to get out of bed in the morning." End quote. Elizabeth became one of the first people who were put on the drug Prozac after it received FDA approval. But as she was waiting for it to take effect, she tried ending her own life, which shocked even her. It was an overdose, and it happened in her therapist's office. As her therapist later explained, it was Elizabeth's last attempt to hold on to the person she was for so many years. In the movie, for some reason, overdose is replaced with a wrist and a piece of glass, and Elizabeth doesn't go through with it in the end. And I think I know why it was done this way. The movie really wanted to leave the audience with a happy feeling after dragging them through all the hysterics. But quite frankly, the result looks like a pharmaceutical commercial for Prozac. One pill and all your problems are gone. Which is far from what the last chapter of Prozac Nation is about. After the initial high caused by the survival of a suicide attempt plus the effect of a new drug subsided, Elizabeth found herself in the same old patterns. She went through different types of medication to find the mix that works, and even on them, she would sometimes experience severe depressive episodes. Quote, "The secret I sometimes think that only I know is that Prozac really isn't that great. Of course, I can say this and still believe that Prozac was the miracle that saved my life and jump-started me out of a full-time state of depression, which would probably seem to most people reason enough to think of the drug as manna from heaven. But after 6 years on Prozac, I know that it is not the end but the beginning. Mental health is so much more complicated than any pill that any mortal could invent. A drug can work only as well as the brain allows it to, and after a while, a strong, hardy, deep-seated depression will outsmart any chemical." End quote. For a few years after Elizabeth began taking medication, she practically forgot about therapy. She saw a psychopharmacologist who, as she writes, was basically a drug pusher with a medical degree. She believed taking medication was enough, even with the occasional lapses. Plus, it was hard to find a good therapist again after leaving university and coming back to New York. Quote, "But then, as I found myself ruining relationships, alienating employers and other people I worked with, and falling all too frequently into depressive blackouts that would go on for days and would feel as desolate and unyielding as the black wave scares I'd spent much of my pre-Prozac life running from, I realized I needed therapy. Years and years of bad habits, of being attracted to the wrong kinds of men, of responding to every bad mood with impulsive behavior, cheating on my boyfriend, or being lax about my work assignments, had turned me into a person who had no idea how to function within the boundaries of the normal non-depressive world. I needed a good therapist to help me learn to be a grown-up, to show me how to live in a world where the phone company doesn't care that you're too depressed to pay the phone bill, that it turns off your line with complete indifference to such nuances." End quote. Moreover, Elizabeth is concerned regarding overprescription of Prozac and, in general, other antidepressants. It's a well-known fact by now that America is over-medicating itself, and Elizabeth understands that there should be some distinction between the people in severe cases who need medication to survive and those who might be just going through a hard time and can benefit from other alternative treatments available. Quote, "The trouble is that when we get around to solutions, it always seems to come down to pills. Deep clinical depression is a disease, one that not only can, but probably should, be treated with drugs. But a low-grade terminal enemy, a sense of alienation or disgust and detachment, the collective horror at a world that seems to have gone so very wrong, it's not a job for antidepressants. As Prozac becomes viewed as a silly drug for crybabies, the people whom it might really help, the ones who need it, will start to think that Prozac won't help them. It seems entirely possible to me now that people will forget how severe, crippling, and awful depression really is." End quote. I know that some might think, and I have seen such opinions in some reviews, that Elizabeth is adding to the stigma surrounding medication, which of course is not true. The woman herself was on meds for the rest of her life, and as she writes, they saved her many times. It's a case-by-case situation. There's so many varieties. Some people need to go on meds first in order to even respond to other treatments. Some just find therapy useless, while others praise it for improving their lives without medication. And even while you're on meds, it's not all perfect because people deal with side effects, and you should know about them. As Elizabeth writes, taking drugs breeds taking more drugs sometimes. And even having these options is such a privilege. It's hard to find a competent therapist. There's shortage of professionals, and they're not able to spend more time on you to understand what your individual treatment should be like. So usually they just throw medication at people because it's quicker than getting to the bottom of the problem. Also because medical industry is still progressing, there are so many things we still don't know about our brains and about mental illnesses. You just take what's available because sometimes you don't have any other choice. Elizabeth hoped that the success of her first book would bring her some type of salvation, but nothing really changed.
All in all, I was still me, and I didn't like that at all. I was quite disappointed by that. I found that very upsetting.
What parts of yourself did you hope to shed or hope to change?
There was nothing in particular I wanted to change. I just wanted to feel better, and I didn't feel better. I felt the same. Everything they say, that people tell you this all the time, but any real change that's going to happen to you is from the inside. But it's still really amazingly disappointing to see that is so true.
At one point, the reliable antidepressants stopped working. Elizabeth was tired all the time. She had trouble focusing, so she was prescribed a stimulant commonly used to treat ADHD, which, if misused, can be very addictive. That was the start of yet another love story. Quote, "Pills are my everything, and these pills are deep inside of me. What person could ever get this close? Who would want to? And I swear to you, and I don't care how this sounds, I think it's love. If you don't understand, you don't know what love is." End quote. After Prozac Nation, Elizabeth received a $500,000 advance for her second book, an essay collection titled Bitch in Praise of Difficult Women.
There's a whole section devoted to depressed women who are, difficult, I guess. I wanted to try to debunk, the myth that, say, Sylvia Plath and Sexton and, kind of professional depressives were these very sad, meek, sensitive people. I think they were very difficult and very out of hand and very kind of energy sucking. I wanted to tell another part of that story.
During the period in which she was supposed to be writing it, Elizabeth first became addicted to and then to other hard drugs. The people she worked with eventually became aware of her problem, but Elizabeth refused to go to rehab. She wanted to finish her book first. So she physically moved into her publisher's office, where all she did was use and write. Elizabeth also liked tweezing hair out of her legs for hours and shoplift, but that changed after she got arrested. Additionally, she got involved with a married man. Quote, "Because addiction got me what I needed. Finally, people take my sorrow seriously. Drugs put the fear of God into people the way a bad mood, even one that goes on for a decade, just does not. You can always wake up feeling better. That's always the hope with the depressive. But no one around me harbors that hope any longer. They're petrified. They're disgusted. At long last, my pain is a serious matter. I've won." End quote. Elizabeth relapsed immediately the first day she got out of rehab, where she'd spent 4 months. The same week, she would go on a messy tour for her book, Bitch. On the cover, she's topless with her middle finger up. She was told it would benefit the marketing, but the reviews were mixed, and many said that it was a book full of rants that didn't really go anywhere, and now you know why.
So it was a terrible tour. And so the book itself really suffered. The cover of the book, I really hated it. I hated it from minute one. I thought it missed the point, but mainly because I just didn't like the picture. It wasn't me, but I was too up. Like when people said to me, "Oh, really, it's the best idea, everyone loves it," I just was like, whatever.
Elizabeth would be high during her interviews and TV appearances. She would smuggle her drugs into other countries. She would have a rehab romance with a recovering alcoholic, which of course didn't end well. She would get clean, and a week after getting clean, she would find out that she was pregnant. She would end up having an abortion. Quote, "You can have all kinds of good, solid beliefs, but in practice, it all goes out the window. At this point, I'm almost anti-abortion. Not in a legal or even a moral sense. It's just that I can't imagine why anyone would put herself through it. I can't imagine why anyone would put herself through an unwanted pregnancy or an unwanted child either. I'm sure that's much worse. But I'm left with a feeling that no one should have an abortion. At any rate, I will never have one again. But my whole life has fallen through the divide between theory and practice. I never quite live up to what I'm supposed to be. Most people would expect that my financial, artistic, and intellectual independence would be matched with an equal degree of emotional independence. But that's not how it is at all. All my good, solid ideas, all my feminist principles, all my hearty beliefs. And in the end, I just go to mush. That's why I do drugs. They fill the lacuna between who I am and who I want to be, between what I think and what I feel." End quote. Elizabeth stopped using in 1998.
I have to say, getting clean, I never felt so much of a sense of God, because every day, for the first year, every day that I didn't use, it was a miracle.
In 2001, her second memoir was published, in which she revealed all the humiliating truths of her addiction you've just heard. I loved this book to death and bawled my eyes out when I finished it, but once again, it received the same criticism as Prozac Nation. Elizabeth said, quote, "I think it's sickening to people that I could be 34 and have written not one but 2 books about my own landscape. I think sadly I picked the wrong medium. Musicians make albums about their emotional lives. I think I got stuck with the wrong talent, and that's sad. It's sad for literature, by the way." End quote. During this time, there were some issues with the movie adaptation of Prozac Nation. Production wrapped up in the summer of 2000. The movie premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 8, 2001. Distribution rights were acquired by Miramax Films. However, the movie's theatrical release kept being delayed. Quote, "A lot of distributors find themselves enamored of a movie. Then when they get down to the marketing and have test audiences screen it, the response is not what they would have hoped." End quote. It was hard for people to find Elizabeth's character likable, but another factor that contributed to the movie's delay was Wurtzel's comments about 9/11. She told the Toronto Globe and Mail in February 2002, quote, "I had not the slightest emotional reaction. I thought, this is a really strange art project. It was the most amazing sight in terms of sheer elegance. It felt like water. It just slid, like a turtleneck going over someone's head. I just felt like everyone was overreacting. People were going on about it. That part really annoyed me." End quote. Wurtzel later said that the article misrepresented her. Quote, "Both me and my apartment were destroyed on September 11th. I have the misfortune of living within 50 yards of the World Trade Center, and I was extremely upset about that even at the time that I did the interview." End quote.
Sometime after 9/11, I was on this NPR panel about humor after 9/11, and I said maybe this is just a Jewish thing, but to me, the worse things get, the funnier they get. And like the funnier I think things are, the more of a sign it is that things are really horrible. I mean, that tends to be how I cope with things. So
the film was never given a theatrical release in the United States. It instead premiered on TV in 2005. In 2004, Elizabeth applied to Yale Law School because she was always interested in law, but she wasn't planning to practice it.
I mean, everything I do after like having had the success I had with Prozac Nation, I do because I feel like it. I felt like writing a few more books. Then I felt like going to law school.
She would continue writing articles for different magazines and newspapers, and her bold, shameless thoughts offended many. Quote, "I love to argue. I am in it for the headache. I don't need you to be on my side. I'm on my side. Everyone is entitled to my opinion. I love being controversial because that's the closest you get to everyone agreeing with you. The other choice is no one is paying attention." End quote.
I feel like it's funny, I feel like you can shock people now by saying that like Lena Dunham has inexcusable thighs. I mean, she does.
You just ruined my next question. No, go ahead.
It seems to be that like I guess like that's what's shocking is that like that you're critical. I mean, apparently like you can't be mean.
In 2015, Elizabeth got married, and the same year, months before her wedding, she had found out that she had breast cancer. Life really couldn't let this woman be happy, but Elizabeth was unique in her attitude towards it. Quote, "I hate it when people say that they're sorry about my cancer. Really? Have they met me? I'm not someone that you feel sorry for. I'm the original mean girl. And now I have advanced breast cancer. Cue the sorries. Seriously? Sorry for what? Yes, I know. Most people are not happy about cancer. Shame on most people. You have a choice about how you see everything that happens to you. You cannot choose how you feel, but you can choose your attitude. I have never cried about breast cancer. It's not that kind of thing. It's not like having a broken heart. Everyone else can hate cancer. I don't. Everyone else can be afraid of cancer. I'm not. It's part of me. It's my companion. I live with it. It's inside of me. I have an intimacy with cancer that runs deep. Do you know what I'm scared of? Nothing. Cancer just suits me." End quote. Elizabeth died on January 7th, 2020, from cancer complications. She was only 52. I'm sad the world lost Elizabeth Wurzel so soon because she was special, and I hope she truly believed that. I want to end this video on something uplifting. There are many quotes from Wurtzel that I like. Sadly, many of them I just couldn't fit into this video. But this one is Elizabeth's piece of advice in praise of making mistakes in life. May you make many of them along the way. May you make them left, right, and center. And when you do, may you never claim to have profited from them. May you never ever chalk them up to lessons learned or experience gained or any of that trite commonplace bullshit. Just enjoy your idiocy, cry about it, and bask in it. And be glad you're lucky enough to have a life that has room for some stupidity and lolling about and kicking around. Because, you know, that's how it goes. And that is what it means to be living.